For these two midi d'archi today, I'm very glad to introduce well, Rui Pinto, Studiolo, and Antoine Collet, that is representing Collet Muller. So two architectural practices that we find very sharp and relevant today. Studiolo operating between Switzerland and Portugal mostly, and Collet Muller mostly in France. And I will not dive extremely long into their work because I think they will do that better than me, and we are already running a bit late. But essentially, we found relevant that they both work on architecture at various scales and on interiors, but not only. And we are extremely glad to have you both today. So I'll just let the floor to who is starting? Okay, so Rui. Thank you.
Is it okay if I stay here? Okay, I just put it like this. Okay. Okay. So first of all, thanks a lot for having me. It's really nice to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really looking forward. We already met in some of you know in Zoom for the small introduction letter, and now not showing a theoretical project, but showing a little bit of the work I do in the studio. And I'm also quite happy to be in Geneva because actually I started my architecture life here. After graduating, I was 1 year working in Geneva, and then I moved to Lausanne and to Zurich after that. So it was just 1 year, but I still keep a lot of memories, and I actually lived quite close to this building. So it's quite funny that how life turns around. So thanks again for having me. The lecture or the small conversational story that I will present is called Shadows and Other Signs of Life. I will try to keep short. Sometimes I will read a little bit. I hope it's not annoying. Sometimes I just explain things, okay? So first I just read this sentence that says that the shadow is the autonomous element capable of producing through its own array a singular impactful image. Even so, it's always the result of the incidence of a light source on a body, a projection. One can lose oneself in the shadow directly or in that to which it evokes or redirects. So this idea of this autonomy of one element like a shadow that has for sure his own capacity to astonish someone by his own composing and aesthetic qualities has always fascinated me. And in the 70s, Ellsworth Kelly, an artist that was quite interested in shape, he was just taking his camera around the city, and he was just trying to find shape in nature through the meaning of the shadow. Although these shadows, they possess quite interesting and meaningful aura, one cannot also stop to think on the object that casts them, of course. And I try to think that this is a kind of a way that one can also work in architecture. And to show a shadow that it's quite important to me, it's this work of Andy Warhol, and I will read a quote. So it says that shadows had long fascinated Warhol before he devoted himself to them as a subject in their own right. The result was an exceptional series of paintings, or disco decor as he named them, in which included one vast environmental work of 102 parts. And there is almost nothing on them, yet they seem to be pictures of something. So I think that what is really incredible in this work, and of course it changes a lot when you see all of them together, is although one can be astonished by the composition, by just this frame of this shadow, it's also, one cannot stop to think what actually gave origin to it. So I think that both dimensions are quite interesting in this work. So shadows have this power that we are now speaking. For me, it's an intriguing dimension of some works, and I'm deeply interested in architecture that, like shadow, emanates on aura, but at the same time opens doors to the imagination and resends our ideas to other layers and to the possible sources that casted it, to ideas, stories, experiences. And some buildings are shadows of other things, and I personally like a lot those types of buildings. The lecture is actually named after a book that was published after Warhol's death, that is called Shadows and Other Signs of Life, where a collection of all these still lifes with shadows was put together. And some of them you can see directly the objects, like in the skull one, and some of them are more like the one I showed you before, where one can have more space for imagination. And so to speak about these shadows, how then can we translate this to art or architecture? And for that, I think this picture of Jeff Wall, it's quite interesting and good way to understand what I'm trying to speak. So it's not too abstract. So I just reread again. Sudden Gust of Wind is a large color photograph displayed in a light box. It depicts a flat, open landscape in which 4 figures in the foreground are frozen as they respond to a sudden gust of wind. Although this image has, of course, incredible qualities, and one can almost really feel the slowness of the air bringing all these papers up, for a more awakened eye or cultivated eye, one can, of course, think about the Okusai painting, Travels Caught in a Sudden Breeze at Edigi, that is a part of a bigger constellation that I think 36 paintings that are views of the Mount Fuji. And this is totally expressed. So Wall was really looking at that painting, and he works a lot with the history of art, and this composition is worked out in order to bring us to this universe of Okusai. So I reread again. Wall used the sense of movement through the image from left to right, resulting from scattering papers and other evidence of wind direction, as a device to arrest the viewer's eye and move them about the photograph. To make the work, Wall photographed actors over a 5-month period in a landscape outside his hometown of Vancouver, at times when similar weather conditions prevailed. He then digitally collaged elements of the photograph in order to achieve the desired composition. The result is a picture that appears staged in the manner of a classical painting. The study is crossed by a grid of diagonal, vertical, and horizontal lines to help the artist map out the positions of the painting's components. His work is based on his extensive knowledge of the theories and techniques of classical painting. So when you see them together, although the Jeff Wall picture has for sure his own capacity to surprise and to captive our eye, I think personally I like a lot this idea that it resends to a work of a previous artist and to previous ideas. And of course, one can see directly here Okusai, but we could even speak about Velázquez or Manet that for sure are present in his work. So for me, this picture of Jeff Wall is a little bit like a shadow also, that is able to be autonomous, but at the same point opens the opportunity to think about the object that, or the work that kind of casted it. In order to speak a little bit more concretely, or how these things translate in the work I try to do, I will show you just quickly a small project. It's called To Cook. I try to name all the projects that I do with the verb, because I think that the projects are complex, but the way we name it can be quite simple. And it's a restaurant, so it seems normal. So this project is in Portugal. It's in a natural landscape in the interior. It's called Serra de São Mamede, and it's a really not dense area, so there's almost no edifications, and it's really in a small village, and it's situated in a street. Did you see mouse? Yeah, okay. So it's situated in a street where you just have houses, dwelling houses. This is fundamental for the development of the project. So all these small objects that you see are houses, and this is also a really small restaurant next to it. And the client already had a restaurant, there working in the ground floor, and in the upper part, the ancient owner of the house was still living, and all the upper part were still a house. So the restaurant had this kind of strange character that in the street level, it could show a little bit of more public dimension because of the type of window and the proportion, and of course the brise-soleil. But then it was really like a house in the upper part. And it was a house sitting in a street full of houses. So this was the upper plan, and the client could then buy the second floor from the ancient owner. And then he also bought this small garage that was next to it. And he wanted to extend the restaurant and also then use this outside space that was a terrace. And the idea is, of course, the kitchen was really small, so one must, of course, feel a kind of a need to put a program all together. But I was actually more interested in the themes that were present, since like the character of domesticity of the street, but also that someone was living here above a restaurant, and that external house that was more like a storage space. How could these things connect and bring them together in a kind of a certain language? So then the first work was more or less to find and to understand that, of course, a restaurant could not work like a house. So the owner or the client would really need a bigger space. And then we would need to create a bigger room. So this was the first idea, that one must open a certain space. But knowing that, I was also quite worried that one could lose this idea and this sensibility to this more domestic characteristic of the house. And this was then a theme that I tried to explore later. It was a little bit about cleaning annex structures that were built quite randomly, and to create spaces that could then interact with each other. When I was doing this process, the idea of how this project could come together was not so easy, because there was parts that would be outside built and parts that would be inside built. And how can you, with such a small critical mass like this one, build a language that could, in a certain way, express a vision of architecture, was a huge theme. So then I thought that a little bit like an hermit crab, they have this strong body that is always outside, and they can survive to the exterior because it's strong and it's resistant. And then to their soft body, they always need to find a kind of a home for them, because the body is soft and it's more volatile to external attacks. So a little bit like this guy here, I tried to build a strong body in the outside, in the new part. And when this project would enter the inside of the house, then he could be really soft. So for the external part, we imagine this concrete and cement block body, and then inside of the house, where the project was already protected, a soft body in wood took place. Although this materiality vision was present, I was still quite keen to maintain this and to work with these ideas of domesticity, and how can a more public program still respond to this type of vision. And I thought a lot about this project by Christopher Alexander. He's actually more a theoretical architect, and he wrote a really important book that, if you don't know, I recommend it. That is called The Pattern Language. And he built a couple of projects, and one of them is this Linz Cafe. And as Linz Cafe, it was a temporary restaurant made in wood in Ufer, and inside of it, he developed the language that with a certain niche, and all these things remind me a lot of how a house could be, although you could still feel a certain promise of the publicness of it. And it was really seated in this, next to a river, in this beautiful landscape. And when I look at it, I like to believe that the choice of the color green, it creates an interior that it's still an exterior. And also when you are inside in this relation through the mean of the window, you could almost also then read it as a continuity. So inside and outside are slightly put in question, or barriers. I think my confirmation that he was perceiving a certain domestic theme is that later he built a couple of houses in Washington, and then he retakes the same type of language in order to achieve this scale of domesticity. Another important point that I was already speaking before was this idea that before there was a house there. And although I needed to make a big space, I wanted that in a certain way, this spirit of the old house could still be casted in this space. So what we decided is that the existing floors were like cement tiles, and we could recover almost all of them, but it was not enough to make the full room. So I decided to make the print of the plan in the floor. So you can, when you are in the room, you can still read the footprint or the plan of the previous house. And we actually built the plan with the cement tiles that we recovered from the existing floor. And then just by having a different color, one can read the room with his perimeter, a kind of a line that builds the space. And then the gray areas are actually where the walls more or less were taking place. And this is more or less the aspect of the finished room. So the soft body of the hermit crab in wood with the green, with this type of soft language. And then in the plan, you can read how the house was, kind of at least. And then here, it's where the doors were. So you could almost, like a kid, play and just cross this between these squares in these points. Another really important idea was this question of the deepness of the plan. So there's areas that are almost no light, and this possibility to build a really long, to create a really long perspective was also quite important for me. So I tried to work with different and several plans and atmospheres that when one passes from one space to the other, there's always a different relation with the surrounding. And I wanted that this layering would create a certain confusion, although that is not so big. Because of the amount of information, one could still kind of lose himself, just be guided by a certain light in the end of the parcours, with a kind of a vision in the landscape, a little bit like in this painting of Di Chirico. So like we were speaking, we would come inside of this restaurant in this new house, in this new block, that it's really tough, with a facade in metal. And then there's just a small top light to the south. So there's always a way that the light enters in this space. This is more or less how it's built. So it's really, it's kind of a strong body, and it's really economical, just the structure with cement tiles. And some of the tiles in the end, we had some more, and then we could still use them to make a kind of a tapish in the entrance. Like you normally, when you enter in a house, you always have a tapish. So I wanted to make a tapish where the persons would feel a little bit like in a kind of a hall of a house. And then from this space, you would pass in a really compact space, super small, almost no light, no view, no direct view to the exterior. And then through this space, because it's really compact and really small, when you would enter the eating room, and because of course also of the inclination of the roof, you would enter in the highest point. So it would create I hope, a quite dramatical sensation through the body. So this is the space of transition, where this body just makes the full wall. And then from here, you pass in this kind of small mouth that it's open to the more important room, and then you arrive in this space. And this space has 3 big windows that relate the interior with the landscape that it's in front of it. So I like to believe that the end of this way, it's this, no? So it's the chair, the table that it's still missing here, and then the natural reserve with this kind of forest spirit. One important idea is that also that in the lower part of the restaurant, it was super small, and because of that, they had to open the kitchen to the clients. So they and it was quite vividly. You would enter and always say good morning to the persons that were working in the kitchen. And when you were a normal client or regular client, you would say, "Oh, I really don't feel to have that today. Can you just make me something different?" So this kind of personal relation was also a quite important thing. And for that, we tried to promote this still relation, although the kitchen took place in another volume. We opened this window to the kitchen that you can see there. So you can, although it's not the same, it's the same but different. So you can always keep this relation. Although you are in the living room, you can always see the persons in the kitchen, and the kitchen it's not this autonomous and enclosed atmosphere. So it's part of the same cosmos, and everyone works and lives together in this space. And to finalize, this is a little bit the context where the house is built. So Alentejo is this region in Portugal where yellow is really important. Almost all the houses are white because it's quite warm. And it's one of the poorest regions in Portugal. So you will not find so many facades with stone. The importance of the elements in a facade were given by color. So you could always read the color, and the color frames the importance of the elements, so the door and the window normally. So the color was a kind of a sign of importance. And what one can also understand is that you always read the yellow, because the white it's transformed in a kind of a background for the yellow. So this is more or less the context. And in the street, although it's a black and white photo, I'm sorry, this was also yellow. So the street is full of houses like this. And although it's then a street full of houses, I wanted to make a house that would still inscribe itself in the context to kind of look like a house, but that would take these themes and work with them differently. So I decided that the yellow should, yes, frame something important, but I decided that we should look at the white. And then I remember, of course, the work of Joseph Albert. And by putting a lot of layers here in the sense of yellow, he really makes the white square in more or less the center of the painting really, really, really important. And I just read you a small quote I wrote. So in this series defined by unmitigated adherence to one pictorial formula, the square, the optical effects Albers create, shimmering color contrasts, and the illusion of receiving and advancing plans were meant not so much to deceive the eye as to challenge the viewer's faculties of visual reception. This shift is emphasizes from perception wielded by the artist to reception engineered by the viewer. His philosophical root of the Homage to the Square series. Albers tried to teach the mechanics of vision and show even the uniformed viewer how to see. With Rays, this painting is specifically called With Rays. With Rays is one painting from the Homage to the Square series. Its color composition is comprised of an inner square of duly gray, almost white, and three surrounding squares in varying tones of yellow. The gray square or white, the palest of the four, seems to float against this more vivid background. This arrangement also encouraged the viewer's eye to move outward from the center of the composition. That optical progression, in addition to the sun-like golden tones of the three or other squares, may have inspired the title of this work. So one first sees the white, that is the color that in the normal context of Alentejo is neglected. So you see this kind of shape first, and then still, you can still read the yellow, and I like to believe that it's still a house of Alentejo. But when you compare to the neighbor, we inverted it, no? So here you see first the white, and here you see first the yellow. And this is more or less the final result of the shape that some accidents that already were there, I think they give a more interesting character to the house, because it's really not like fully flat. And I like to believe that it's still a house from Alentejo. So there's shadows of the existing context, but there's also shadows from Albert's and other ideas that I was interested in. And then when you turn, there's even more Albert's moments. So I just read the last quote, that it's kind of an opening for discussion. Our profession deals with tangible and real questions. One must think in what, how, when, and if so built. We have economic factors to respect. law and market pressure to conditionate the work clients that are good or bad, with visions and their own personal wills. It also seems that architecture should somehow solve the climate and sociological crisis of our time, and of course we need to work on that. Nevertheless, also these dimensions of the profession that play a fundamental role are not more than things to take care, questions to solve, and things to implement in the process of work. I think that the role of the architect is fundamentally to shuffle soul into this problem, solving constructions to allow oneself to dream about things that are not necessarily there, to speak about beauty and to other aesthetic dimensions. I believe strongly in an architecture full of shadows that is able to contribute to its time questions, but at the same time is able to create enthusiasm and have a kind of a visceral impact. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I try to be quick. So when the rock is made of paper, I try to be linked to the subject of your studio. So I understood paper is kind of a project and rock is kind of the reality. So sometimes the rock is that strong that it can smash your paper. So I try to show you some context where we worked recently, 3 projects, where the reality is really strong. So you have to play with it. So the first context, it's in France, of course. It's kind of far from Switzerland context, but I hope you will understand. This is not the countryside. It's not even the suburbs. It's like in between. There is no interesting client, maybe. There is not that much budget. There is no enthusiast politics about architecture. But it's almost everywhere in France. It's always in between city and kind of new suburbs, but it's always in between, somewhere here. And it's a world of houses and gardens and families. And it's a world where the architecture is almost invisible. It's a world where when you want something, like a detail, for example, you work with really nice builders, but they don't really read your plans and sections. So if you want something, you have to do it with them. So the question is, in this kind of really strong rock, how can you make architecture? So this is the first project I show you, which is in Montévrain. It's like 40 kilometers from Paris. And the first thing in this kind of context is maybe the plan, because it might be the only thing will stay after the project, maybe. So here it's a mix between collective housing, you can see here, and kind of individual houses there. So we put maybe all the budget in the parking lot, which is really narrow and really long. So it means it's kind of expensive. But this parking lot is under the collective housing, just to let the house behind, like in a big garden without cars. So you can enjoy public garden and also private gardens here. So here are the collective housing on the limit and behind the individual houses. So when you don't have that much budget, proportions are really interesting and really strong to play with. These houses are from the beginning of the century. They are not these houses that you can see everywhere. You know, the really low one, really large, kind of a beige. That's linked, they are linked to the car history. These ones are older and they are small and quite high. And we like these proportions. So behind this, a lot of ornamental things that we can like too, maybe, we are really interested in this proportion of a narrow and high with a tiny roof. So at the office, we work a lot with a double slab roof. I don't know why, but here it's 12 projects and they all have roofs. And behind this form, we are interested in the shape and in the space then that can create this roof. So to come back to this project, we propose the client that the aim of the client is to sell houses. But we propose to this client to make these houses a bit higher than before. So we could create a new space in it. And the installation just stop here. This is the normal house that he can sell. And this is the house we want him to sell. So there is a new space. In fact, it's only 3 layers of brick. It creates this space, and the people then can have this house, have this new space that they can use for the same price. And then in this space, we put a window. Even if there is no installation yet, there is already lights. That's what we did. Nothing more, maybe. Then we just follow what this reality gave us. So in France, the builders, I told you they were they don't really plan, but the one who work on the roof, they're good. Here you can't see, but on this, how do you say it in English? Tuile tiles, roof tiles. Here you have 2 of them. I think it's good tricks. So with them, you can do really nice detail for really like a low budget. But here you see the tiles, they just stop before the limit of the roof. It's a really simple detail, but it made the roof look like a piece of cardboard, like in our models, like this. And then for the facade, this is enduit. So this is really the cheapest thing you can have, but it lets you change the color easily. So we just use frames around the windows to create this kind of ornamental aspect. It's really simple and everyone knows how to do it in France. For the collective house buildings, I mean, they don't have garden, but they have loggia, so they need rails. So we thought rails can be designed to be something else. So we designed it as a bench to make this loggia kind of a garden. And it became the facade. So the second project I show you is in a really historical context. It's in Dammartin-en-Goële, which is not far from Paris, like the other one. And it's on the top of a hill. And there is an old castle and 2 churches. So in this type of context, you need to deal with the ABF, which is an architect who has to control the form of your building to know if it fits or not with the historical context. So you see, we are on the limit of the slope, and we are playing this kind of 2 volume. So it's 26 apartments. So like in this painting of Morandi, you don't really know if it's 2 buildings or 1. In fact, it's 1 building, 1 stairway to be efficient, and always like a question of budget, it's a bit cheaper to do like that. But because of the form of the plan, we managed to have for each apartment 2 orientation and a big loggia. Also, even for the small one, he has a second orientation. And then also the corridor has lights. This was the facade. So it was a competition and double slab roof and classic shutters with the window. So we are playing, and this big chimney, we are playing with the things we can find around us. So everything was going well until the rock arrived. And the ABF say, it's really nice, okay, but just white is forbidden. That was really bad news because of the budget, we couldn't have nothing more than plastic window. And when you use plastic, the cheapest plastic windows you can have, I mean, not the cheapest, but really cheap, you have only white. I like white, so we make everything white to make it fresh, but it was forbidden. So the only choice we had that exists, it's really light gray and a sad beige. So that was really hard for us, but we say, okay, we have to play with that. So all the choices came from this rock after that. So we use both beige for one and gray for the other one. And all the choice of colors of every element are linked to the beige or the gray. So this is the building, the context. So you see the wall of the old castle and the wall of the small houses there. And from behind, from the slope, and you see that these two volumes with these colors appears maybe it's stronger than with the white facade. Inside the apartment, so you are here in the living room and the kitchen over there, you recognize the beige windows that we started to like finally, and the loggia. Of course, also in the collective corridor that has a window looking at the church, everything is linked to the beige window, right? And the floor and the wall. And the stairway is linked to the gray window, which is gray and green. Then the facade is made of enduit, like the last project. So we hold the zinc like that to keep our facade clean. And we play with this enduit that when you have this material, you need joints. So here is just the way we did the joint, joint de dilatation between two buildings. Using here it's the plastic tool and make the joint as a simple shadow. And we keep some budget to make a wall made of stone that we took from another house not far from this place. It's a Pierre Meulière, which is really typical in this context. And finally, we thought that with this color, like the building it's a bit more discret and playing with the color of the landscape. This is just the plan and the loggia of the apartment. Okay, so the last project I show you, it's a really small one, this one, and it's about interior. And it's for one of my friend, really good friend, in front of a really nice garden in Paris. And it's really difficult to work for your friend when you want a restaurant, because you know that you will go there really often, even every week. So you want to do something that you are not like, looking at everything. So not over design maybe. So this is a typical French restaurant. They are always playing with lights and mirror, and the cimez in English, I don't know. It's the lower part of the wall, which is made of wood here. So we try to play with this kind of things. So this was one first try maybe. And we had this big mirror to have the garden in the back of the room. So the garden is on your back now. And you have this wooden cimez. And what was interesting, so after many tries, we finally went to this. So it's kind of same thing, but using light tiles and really dark gray, maybe black floor to let the food exist on the table. So this is the beginning of the construction site. I mean, some ugly sketch to show your friend that don't understand your paper, of course. The first tiles that are coming like piece of paper on the wall. So when you are like playing with that, it's interesting to show that this is not massive construction. So you see as the joints are not aligned. But the rock came again. And my friend, which is really like looking for all things, he spent all the weekend to scratch the floor and find this interesting floor. But it was available on only a few meters of the ground floor, and it's really hard to clean. And it doesn't fit with the tiles we choose because we wanted some contrast, we wanted some dark floor. But yeah, it's nice. And at that moment, I remember we were talking about that, and a really old lady came in the street, and she was looking at the floor, and she was like, "Oh, that's the floor of my old coiffeuse." And she was really emotional about it. My friend was like, "Okay, we have to keep it." So we were okay. So the rock was that strong, I couldn't avoid it. So we bring some leftover of tiles from another project, and we try to understand what we could do with this dark floor, with these tiles we already choose. And we finally decide to copy this floor where we saw on the floor. to be like a souvenir of this floor. And we started to arrange the flower as we were gardening on the floor, you know, but it was so long and the builder was like, so I thought, okay, it's stupid that we have that much flowers. We need more flowers, but for the same work, you know. And you remember we had this mirror above the CMES. So the second big change was to do this. The two mirrors in front of above the CMES, one will go on the floor to show us more flowers. And it changed completely the space. So we started to use cardboard to understand how to make this detail. So that was the result. So you see, for the same amount, we could double the flowers on the floor. With flowers on the table, the lamp, as a traditional restaurant, Parisian restaurant. And finally, this image is like this restaurant is as just an image of the garden with a CMES high enough to hide the car of the street and some flowers on the floor. So just like to say that sometimes the rock is a way to go beyond what you expect from your paper. Thank you.